Here is the true life story of Left Behind in the Field, expanded into 7 individual parts. Each part builds on the last to create a complete and engaging narrative. Left behind in the field. 72 hours later, she returned with their equipment. The small farming community of Baker's Creek had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and their tractors in the field without worry. It was a town held together by handshake deals and the unspoken rule that neighbors looked out for one another. For the Harrison family, this was the only life they had ever known. Old Man Harrison, a stoic and weathered farmer in his late 60s, ran the operation with an iron fist and a strict schedule. His son, Mark, was his reluctant shadow, a man in his 30s who had never quite earned his father's respect, but showed up every day out of duty. And then there was Clara, Mark's wife. Clara had married into the Harrison family 7 years prior, leaving behind her city job as a logistics coordinator to help run the household and manage the chaos of the farm. She was practical, sharp-witted, and tougher than she looked, but to Old Man Harrison, she would always be an outsider. He tolerated her help because he had no choice. The farm was too much work for just 2 men. But in his eyes, she was merely the help. Someone to fetch tools and run errands. Never to be trusted with the real work. It was harvest season, the most critical time of the year. The sky was a perfect autumn blue, but the air was thick with tension. A storm was forecast for the end of the week, and every second of daylight was precious. Old Man Harrison had been barking orders since 4 a.m., pushing Mark and Clara to their limits. The combines were running non-stop, and the support equipment, the tractors, the grain carts, and the fuel trailers needed to be positioned perfectly to keep the operation flowing. On this particular morning, Old Man Harrison decided to switch fields. He ordered Mark to take the big combine to the back 40 while he handled the silage. Clara was told to drive the heavy-duty support truck loaded with spare parts, fuel drums, and a portable welding rig to the edge of the new field so it would be ready. As Clara guided the massive truck across the uneven terrain, the front tire dipped into a hidden gopher hole. The truck lurched violently and sank into the mud, the axle grinding against the dirt. It was stuck, badly. When Old Man Harrison saw the truck half submerged in the mud, his face turned a deep shade of crimson. He stormed over, his work boots heavy on the dry earth, and unleashed a torrent of blame. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't assess the damage. He just screamed about lost time and incompetence, telling her that this is what happens when you let a woman do a man's job. He ordered her to get out and walk back to the barn. He and Mark would deal with the mess later. For now, he needed his good tractor, the big one, to pull the truck out, and he didn't trust her not to mess that up, too. Humiliated and fighting back tears of anger, Clara trudged the 3 miles back to the farmhouse. The wind had picked up and the temperature was dropping. By the time she got home, her hands were numb. She assumed that by evening, the men would bring the truck home, and this would just be another bitter memory. But the evening came and went, and the truck stayed in the field. Old Man Harrison, in his stubbornness, had decided to prioritize the harvesting over retrieving the vehicle. "It's not going anywhere," he had grunted at dinner. "We'll get it Sunday." That night, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She replayed the scene in her head, the anger, the disrespect, but the casual cruelty of being sent away like a naughty child. She wasn't just mad about being yelled at. She was mad about the waste. That truck was full of expensive equipment. If the storm hit, it would all be ruined. But her opinion didn't matter. The next morning, the storm arrived. But it wasn't the rain they expected. It was wind. Howling, relentless wind that stripped leaves from trees and sent loose debris flying across the plains. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her heart sinking as she thought about the truck sitting out there, vulnerable. By midday, Old Man Harrison and Mark were forced inside. The wind was too dangerous to work in the elevated cabs of the combines. The harvest had stopped, but still, no one went for the truck. "It's too windy to walk, and I'm not wasting diesel on a joyride," the old man snapped when Clara suggested they retrieve it. On the third day, the wind died down, but the temperature plummeted. A hard frost settled over Baker's Creek. Clara woke to a silent house. Old Man Harrison had decided to sleep in, exhausted from the stress of the delayed harvest. Mark was nursing a bad back. The truck sat alone in the field for a full 72 hours. As Clara made her coffee, a quiet resolve settled over her. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't make a scene. She simply pulled on her thickest coat, her wool hat, and her insulated gloves. She grabbed the keys to the old farm Jeep from the hook and drove out to the field. She wasn't going to retrieve the truck itself. That was a job for the big tractor. But the equipment in the bed, that was hers to save. When she arrived, the scene was bleak. The truck was dusted with frost, looking like a ghost of the machine it had been. Clara climbed into the frozen bed and began to work. She drained the water from the portable welder so it wouldn't freeze and crack the engine block. She wrapped the spare parts in tarps she had brought. She checked the fuel drums, ensuring the seals were tight. For 2 hours, she worked alone in the freezing cold, her breath misting in the air. It was as she was securing the last tarp that she heard the rumble of an engine. Old Man Harrison's truck bounced over the ridge, with Mark following in the big tractor. They had finally come to fix her mistake. The old man stepped out, ready to issue orders, but stopped dead when he saw Clara standing on top of the flatbed, tightening a rope. Clara looked down at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't say a word. She just jumped down, walked past him, and got into the Jeep. As she drove away, she saw in her rearview mirror the old man walking around the truck, inspecting her work. He was looking at the neatly wrapped equipment, the winterized welder, the secured drums. For the first time in 7 years, he had nothing to say. And the drive back to the farmhouse was short, but for Clara, it felt like a journey across an entirely new landscape. The frost on the windows of the old Jeep blurred the world outside, turning the familiar fields into a soft, white smear. She kept her eyes on the narrow dirt track, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silence in the cab was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Her body was warm from the exertion of the last 2 hours, but a cold knot remained lodged in her chest. It wasn't the cold of the winter air. It was the cold of 7 long winters spent on this farm, trying to prove she belonged. Pulling into the yard, she killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor. The farmhouse loomed ahead, smoke curling from the chimney, a picture of warmth and hearth that felt like a lie to her today. She thought about going inside, making another pot of coffee, or waiting for the men to return with the truck. That was the script. That was what Clara was supposed to do. But for the first time, the script felt unbearably heavy. Instead, she went to the barn. Not the main equipment barn, but the old tack shed attached to the side of the unused stable. It was her space, the one place Old Man Harrison never bothered to go. It smelled of aged leather, hay dust, and metal polish. She kept her small collection of things there, a few gardening tools she had bought herself, a comfortable old chair she had rescued from the curb in town, and a small portable heater. She plugged in the heater, sat down in the chair, and pulled her knees to her chest. The adrenaline that had fueled her for the past few hours was fading, leaving behind a deep, bone-tired weariness. She replayed the moment at the field. The look on her father-in-law's face. It wasn't anger, not this time, but it was confusion. It was the look of a man who had walked onto a stage expecting to perform a play he knew by heart, only to find the set changed and the script missing. Clara realized that in her 7 years on this farm, she had been playing a role assigned to her. She was the city girl, the outsider, the helper. She had accepted the limitations of the part, believing that if she just worked hard enough and stayed quiet enough, She would eventually be promoted to family. But standing on that frozen truck bed, looking down at the two men who were supposed to be her family, she had felt a profound shift. She wasn't waiting for a promotion anymore. She had realized she already held a position they couldn't understand. She was the one who took care of things. Back in the field, Old Man Harrison was experiencing his own kind of reckoning. He stood by the truck bed, his hand resting on a tightly bound tarp. Mark had climbed into the tractor and was maneuvering it into position to pull the truck free. The old man watched his son work for a moment, then turned his attention back to the equipment. He untied one of the knots Clara had made. It was a specific kind of knot, a trucker's hitch, efficient and strong. He knew it well. He had taught it to Mark years ago, but Mark never used it. The boy always preferred baling twine and a quick wrap. This was different. And this was the work of someone who knew what they were doing. He walked around to the welder. He checked the drain plug and saw the fresh water residue on the ground. She had drained it. Of course she had. If he had left it, the block would have cracked by morning. A cracked block meant a $1,000 repair and a week of downtime. Clara had just saved him $1,000 and a week of headache. He looked at the fuel drums, the seals tight. He looked at the spare belts, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent them from drying out and snapping. Mark hopped down from the tractor, wiping his hands on his jeans. "She's hooked up. Ready to pull?" he asked. The old man didn't answer. He just nodded, his eyes still on the truck bed. "Pa, you okay?" Mark asked, walking over. "I'm fine," the old man grunted. He pointed a thick finger at the welder. "She drained the water." Mark looked at it, then at the tarps. "Yeah, looks like she wrapped everything." "Too." The old man climbed into the truck cab, not to move it, but just to sit. He saw the keys were still in the ignition, where Clara must have left them when she got stuck days ago. He picked them up, the metal cold in his palm. He thought about the last 3 days, the storm, the wasted time, the anger he had carried around like a shield. And he thought about Clara, driving out here alone in the freezing cold while he was still in bed, to do a job he had deemed not worth the diesel. "Hey, she didn't have to do this," Mark said quietly from outside the window. He wasn't looking at his father, he was looking at the field, the frosted stubble stretching to the tree line. She could have just let it freeze. The old man said nothing. He started the truck, feeling the engine groan to life, and slowly, with Mark guiding him from the outside, he pulled it free from the mud. The ride back to the farm was silent, the truck bumping along behind the tractor. And for the first time in his life, Old Man Harrison wasn't thinking about the harvest, or the storm, or the lost time. He was thinking about his daughter-in-law, and he was thinking about how he had been wrong. The men didn't come back to the farmhouse right away. They parked the truck and the tractor in the main barn, and Clara could hear the distant clang of tools as they inspected the undercarriage for damage from the mud. She remained in the tack shed, at the small heater doing its best to push back the chill. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't ready to face them yet. She needed to hold on to this strange new feeling of autonomy for a little while longer. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the yard, Clara finally stood up. Her legs were stiff from sitting. She stretched, rolled her shoulders, and walked out of the shed. She didn't go to the barn. She went to the house. She showered, letting the hot water wash away the grime and the tension. She changed into clean jeans and a soft sweater, her own clothes, not the work clothes she usually wore. When she came downstairs, she started dinner. Not a complicated meal, just soup and bread, but she made it for herself. She ate alone at the kitchen table, watching the light fade outside. The back door opened just as she was finishing. It was Mark. He stomped his boots on the mat and walked in, his eyes finding her immediately. He looked tired, but there was something else in his expression, a softness, a question. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she replied. He sat down across from her. "The truck's fine. No damage. We greased the undercarriage just in case." Clara nodded, dipping her spoon into the soup. "Good." Mark hesitated. He was a man of few words, raised by a father who believed that talking about feelings was a waste of breath. But he was also a man who loved his wife, and he knew he had failed her. And he had let his father send her away, and he had stayed silent. The guilt of it had been building for 3 days. "Clara," he started, his voice rough. "I'm sorry. For the other day. For not saying anything." Clara looked at him. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the struggle to find the right words. It softened something in her, but it didn't erase the memory. "I know you are, Mark," she said gently. "But it wasn't just the other day. It's been 7 years." Mark nodded slowly. And he knew she was right. He had seen it every day, and he had done nothing. He had told himself it was just his father's way, that it was easier to keep the peace, that Clara understood. But standing in the field today, watching his father stare at that tarp-wrapped equipment, he had understood something new. Clara didn't just understand the farm. She cared for it. She protected it. And he had never once protected her from the person who hurt her the most. Just then, and the back door opened again. Old Man Harrison walked in. The kitchen, which had felt almost cozy a moment before, suddenly shrank. The air grew thick. The old man stood just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the room, landing on Clara. She met his gaze steadily. She didn't look away, and she didn't get up. Mark looked between them, the tension palpable. He started to rise, to intervene, but his father held up a hand, stopping him. The old man took off his hat, a gesture so rare it was almost shocking. He held it in his gnarled hands, turning it over and over. He looked at the floor, then at the table, then finally, with visible effort, at Clara. "The truck," he said, his voice gruff but quieter than usual. "The welder, you saved it." Clara simply nodded. "Yes." Another long pause. The old man cleared his throat. That was good work. Thinking ahead like that, I didn't—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Apologies didn't come easily to him. They weren't in his vocabulary. He had spent his whole life being the boss, the authority, the one who was always right. Admitting fault felt like a kind of death. But looking at Clara sitting calmly at his kitchen table, he realized she wasn't asking him to die. She was just asking him to see her. "I didn't expect it," he finally finished. "I should have." It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't, "I'm sorry for how I've treated you." But for Old Man Harrison, it was a seismic shift. It was an acknowledgement that he had underestimated her. It was the first crack in the wall he had built between them. Clara recognized it for what it was. She could have demanded more. She could have listed every slight, every cruel word, every time he had made her feel small. But she didn't. She simply nodded. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it. The old man hung his hat on the hook by the door, a ritual he performed every night. But tonight, it felt different. And he walked to the stove and ladled himself a bowl of soup. He sat down at the table, across from Mark, beside Clara. For the first time in 7 years, they ate dinner not as a farmer, his son, and the help, but as 3 people who shared a life. The silence that settled over the kitchen wasn't heavy with resentment. It was tentative, fragile, but it was also new. It was the silence of people learning to be a family. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn, just as she always did. The alarm clock glowed red in the darkness, and for a moment she lay still, letting the events of the previous day wash over her. Dinner had been quiet, but it hadn't been tense. Old Man Harrison had even asked her if she thought the spare belts in the truck were the right size for the older combine, a question he would normally have directed at Mark or answered himself without input. She had told him they were close, but he might need to drill a new tension hole. And he had just grunted and nodded, but it was a grunt of consideration, not dismissal. She dressed in the dark, pulling on her work clothes by feel. When she walked into the kitchen, she expected to be alone. She was always the first one up. But this morning, the light was already on. Old man Harrison was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in his hand, staring out the window at the dark yard. He looked up when she entered. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, on the word feeling strange in her mouth. She moved to the coffee pot, poured herself a cup, and leaned against the counter. She didn't sit at the table. Old habits died hard. The old man took a sip of his coffee. "Storms passed. Forecast says clear for the next 10 days. We got a window." Clara nodded. "Good. We need it." "We do." He set his cup down. "I'm gonna need that support truck out in the west field today. The big combine's throwing a belt every few hours. We're gonna need the welder and the spare parts on standby." Clara waited. This was usually the part where he told her what to do, where to go, how to stay out of the way. He looked at her directly. "You know that truck better than anyone now. You checked it over yesterday. You know what's in the bed." He paused. "I want you to drive it out there, set up the support position, make sure we got what we need." It was such a simple thing, a basic task. But the weight of it was immense, for he was trusting her, not just to follow orders, but to use her judgment. He was acknowledging that she knew the truck, that her inspection mattered, that her presence in the field was an asset, not a liability. Clara set her coffee down. "Okay," she said. "I'll get it ready." She walked out to the barn, the morning air sharp and clean in her lungs. The truck sat where they had parked it, still dusty from the field, but otherwise intact. Clara climbed into the bed and did another inventory. She checked the welder's fluid levels. She organized the spare parts by size. She made sure the fuel drums were secure. When she was satisfied, she climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove it out of the barn. She drove slowly through the yard, past the farmhouse. As she passed the kitchen window, she saw old man Harrison standing there, watching her, his coffee cup in his hand. He didn't wave, and neither did she, but their eyes met through the glass, and in that brief moment, there was an understanding. Things were different now. The west field was a 40-acre plot at the far end of the property, bordered by a creek and a line of ancient oaks. The big combine was already there, idling at the edge of the ready corn, its massive size dwarfing everything around it. Mark was up in the cab, running his morning checks. When he saw Clara pull up in the support truck, he did a double take. He climbed down from the combine and walked over, with a look of surprise on his face. "Pa sent you?" he asked, incredulous. Clara grinned, a real grin, the first one in days. "He said I know the truck best." Mark shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned." He looked at the truck, at the neatly organized bed. "You really did a number on this. Looks better than it has in years." Clara jumped down from the cab. "It just needed some attention." She walked with Mark toward the combine. "He said you're throwing a belt." "Yeah, every few hours. It's the tension arm. It's getting sloppy." Mark gestured to the massive machine. "I'm going to try to get a few hours in before it goes again. Can you stick around, in case I need a quick swap?" Clara looked back at the support truck, sitting ready at the edge of the field. For 7 years, her job had been to fetch and carry, to be invisible until she was needed. Now, she was being asked to stay, to be present, to be part of the team. I'll be right here," she said. The morning passed in a rhythm of work. The combine hummed through the corn, spewing chaff into the air. Clara sat in the truck, listening to the radio, watching the sun climb higher. When the combine's engine pitch changed and Mark's voice crackled over the two-way radio asking for a belt, she was ready. She grabbed the right part, the one she had wrapped in oilcloth, and drove the truck to the combine's side. She handed the belt up to Mark, who swapped it out in 20 minutes flat. By noon, they had lost only an hour to repairs. It was the most efficient morning they had had in weeks. When Old Man Harrison arrived with lunch, he saw the support truck positioned perfectly, the repair done, the combine running again. He looked at Clara, who was leaning against the truck, eating a sandwich. "Belt went?" he asked. "Once," Clara said. "We swapped it. Good as new." He nodded, looking at the combine, then at the truck. "Ah, you had the right part ready." "I wrapped it," Clara said simply. The old man stood there for a long moment, the wind rustling the dry corn stalks. Then he did something he had never done before. He walked over to Clara, reached into the cooler he had brought, and handed her a cold bottle of water. "Good work," he said. And he meant it. The days that followed took on a new cadence. The harvest resumed in full force, the combines running from dawn until the light failed. And Clara was no longer just a figure on the periphery. She was in the field, positioned strategically, anticipating problems before they arose. She listened to the rhythm of the machines, learning to distinguish the healthy hum of a well-oiled combine from the telltale knock of a part about to fail. She became the team's eyes and ears, the one who noticed the small things that could become big problems. Old Man Harrison didn't suddenly become a warm and fuzzy patriarch. That wasn't who he was. But his interactions with Clara shifted subtly. He started explaining why he was making certain decisions, why he was leaving a strip of corn standing along the creek, why he wanted the support truck positioned on the high ground. He was teaching her, treating her like an apprentice rather than a servant. Clara absorbed it all, asking questions when she didn't understand, offering observations when she saw something he might have missed. One afternoon, 5 days after she had retrieved the equipment, a crisis arose. The big combine's final drive chain snapped. It was a catastrophic failure, the kind that could shut down the harvest for a day or more. Mark radioed in, his voice tight with panic. They didn't have a spare chain that size on the farm. They would have to drive 60 miles to the nearest dealer, and by the time they got back, they'd lose half a day of light. Clara heard the panic in Mark's voice. But she also heard something else, an opportunity. She grabbed the two-way radio. "Mark, how many links are broken?" she asked. "I don't know. A bunch. It's wrapped around the sprocket. It's a mess. Can you get it off? Bring it to me?" There was a pause. "Yeah, I guess. Why? Just bring it." 20 minutes later, Mark arrived at the support truck, the broken chain in his hands, heavy and greasy. It was a mess, links twisted and broken. Clara took it from him and laid it out on the tailgate. She examined the damage, counting the links, assessing the break. "We don't have a whole chain," she said, "but we have spare links, and we have the welder." Mark stared at her. "You're gonna weld a drive chain? It'll never hold. It'll be a weak point." Clara shook her head. "Not weld the links, weld a patch. Look." She pointed to the break. "The chain broke here, but the links on either side are good. If we cut out the broken section and splice in new links, it'll be shorter, but it'll work. It'll get us through the day until we can get a new one." Mark was skeptical, but he didn't have a better idea. He helped her unload the welder and fire it up. Clara worked carefully, using a grinder to smooth the rough edges, then fitting the replacement links into place. It was delicate work, requiring steady hands and patience. The sun was beginning its downward arc by the time she finished. She held up the repaired chain. It was shorter, scarred, but intact. "Try it," she said. Mark carried it back to the combine. Clara followed in the truck, ready for the worst. Old Man Harrison had arrived by now, and he stood with Clara, watching as Mark and a hired hand wrestled the chain back into place. When it was done, Mark climbed into the cab, his face a mask of concentration. He engaged the drive. The chain held. The combine lurched forward, the header cutting into the corn. Mark ran it for a full minute, then another, then 5. The chain held. He killed the engine and climbed down, his face split by a wide grin.